Darlantia, Book 1, by Michael Gardner. Read by Michael Gardner. Chapter 3. Darlantia floated lazily in the sky below the cloud layer. Using his keen eyesight, he surveyed the land he had called home for the past 20 years, Dragon Kingdom. An area so large you could explore it for years and still not discover all its secrets. At least, that's what his mother always told him. The truth was that, ever since Darlantia had learnt to fly, he had explored every inch of it. From the south, he had ventured along the border with the vast forest known as the Great Wilderness, and had discovered all the ruins that dotted it, left from an ancient conflict. The watchtower he and his mother called home was one of these, the structure that had been built furthest into their territory. He had flown to the heart of Dragon Kingdom, far in the north, to a mountain known as the World's Nest. It was here that most ancient dragons lived out their days. In their old age, dragons lost their front two arms, but their overall size, especially their wings, continued to grow despite the greying of their scales and mistiness of their eyes. He had hoped to learn knowledge from the ancient dragons, but it was forbidden for youngsters to even be near the World's Nest. Many times Darlantia had heard murmurings and rumours about his parentage, and it was this that had led him to believe that the ancient dragons had been extra hostile towards him. What his mother or father had done to warrant such an attitude toward him, he had yet to find out. The rest of Dragon Kingdom was hundreds of miles of mountain ranges, forests, lakes, and rivers, each area of it claimed by some dragon or another. Most lived uneventful lives and greeted Darlantia only to tell him to move on somewhere else. Darlantia had even ventured far north to the White Lands, or the Ice Wastes, as his mother's maps called them, where the mountains ended and the ground became a vast plain of frozen ice and snow. With no substantial food, it was impossible to stay up there very long. Many young dragons told fascinating stories about what lay deep within the White Lands, but none of those tall tales had proven true during Darlantia's small expeditions. And so, when the view of his mother's mountain, with its ancient watchtower, came into sight, all he could do was greet it with a gentle sigh. Luckily for Darlantia, whilst Dragon Kingdom had become quite dull and tedious for him some years ago, his mother possessed an unparalleled hoard of treasure, especially books and maps, which she had taught him to read and decipher. So Darlantia had taken it upon himself to learn and study all of it, and to organize it. It had taken years, but he finished the work just a few days ago, and now he had a matter he wanted to discuss with his mother. In his claws he clutched a fresh kill, one of the many giant boars that roamed the valleys, and a favourite of his mother's. As usual, Xylia was curled up on top of the watchtower, apparently sleeping peacefully. A few beams of light broke the cloud layer to illuminate the tower and keep. Darlantia gracefully and silently glided towards the tower, but on purpose he landed with a thud, which stirred his snoozing mother. She sniffed loudly, lazily opened her eyes, and spotted Darlantia. He presented her with the boar. She got to her feet and stretched her body, yawning widely in the process. "For me?" she asked, after relaxing and sitting back down. "Yes, who else?" he replied, more than a hint of sarcasm in his tone. She huffed and quickly took the large kill. Flames shot from her maw, and soon it was cooking nicely. Darlantia left his mother to the meal, and nimbly climbed down the tower into the keep. He headed towards the library he had built and organized. Stacks upon stacks of books, scrolls, maps, and anything else that had intellectual value were contained within. The library was organized from oldest to newest and separated into different topics. Many of the books had conflicting messages, as most of them concerned history, his and his mother's favorite subject. The next largest topic was geography, which had also been hard to organize due to the various authors claiming or describing the exact same thing in different ways. For example, Darlantia's mother had collected no less than 10 maps on the Dragon Kingdom. He had discovered none of them were accurate, as he had surveyed the land himself. First, Darlantia headed towards the history section and grabbed the newest book his mother possessed, dated some 50 years ago. He then headed towards the maps section and grabbed a map which was also dated a half-century ago. With these two items in his possession, he headed back towards his mother. As usual, she had left half of the kill for Darlantia, but he ignored it and placed down the book and map on the stone floor. "What have you got there?" she asked. Darlantia enthusiastically jumped straight into why he had brought these items to her interest. Gesturing with a claw, he pointed to the book first. "This is the newest book you possess in your vast collection, mother, dated just 50 years ago, around the time you said you last ventured beyond the Dragon Kingdom." "Ah, yes. Something to do with those human kingdoms always fighting," she cut in. "I can't remember exactly. I was there only briefly." She scratched her head idly with a claw and looked off into the distance. "Yes, exactly," continued Darlantia. "A History of the Warring Kingdoms is the title of the book. It describes 5 human kingdoms, always at war with one another, despite the relatively small land they possess." Darlantia then gestured to the map. "The same 5 kingdoms are shown on this map, and apparently are located southeast of Dragon Kingdom, over the great wilderness." Xylia looked towards the map, which depicted the warring kingdoms in great detail, and broadly outlined the rest of the continent, including Dragon Kingdom and the great wilderness. She then turned her attention back to Darlantia. "And your point, exactly?" "Well, considering how close they are, I could find out the fate of these kingdoms, and bring the collection some fresh and up-to-date material," Darlantia finished. He was aware how nervous he sounded, despite his efforts to the contrary. His mother gazed at him intently for a while. After an awkward pause that felt like forever, she finally spoke. "My son, if you wish to venture beyond our home, then you don't need my permission to do so." Darlantia looked at her, startled. "No, really, it's to collect more up-to-date information. I'm just curious, that's all," he explained. "Whatever the case, you have my blessing to fly to the warring kingdoms. It will be good to get some information on them, given they are our closest neighbors, if you can call them that." His mother turned her head away from him again and rubbed the side of her face with her arm. "You'll come back once you have the information," she added. "Yes, of course, I promise. The flight will take a few days at most, so I expect I could be back within a week," Darlantia said excitedly. "Well, best eat the rest of this boar and make the most of the daylight then," she said, pushing the cooked meat towards him. Xylia watched her son eat the giant boar. He was 20 years old, and so, by dragon standards, was still an infant, but dragons grow up quickly. He was smaller than her, but this made him agile and an incredibly fast flyer. He was healthy as well. His golden green scales shone brightly, and his bronze claws, horns, and spikes were razor sharp. He possessed great strength for any normal creature, but by dragon standards, this was one department in which Darlantia lacked. However, he more than made up for it with his knowledge. The centuries of experience that Xylia possessed had all been passed down to Darlantia in his first 15 years. Everything from hunting skills to languages. And then he had spent the past 5 years studying and learning from the collection she had gathered from the 4 corners of the earth. Xylia would never forget her son's birth, when he had exploded from his egg and breathed fire within his first few seconds of life. He was deeply in touch with his magical ability, something which quite clearly came from his father's side. Thankfully, unlike his father, Darlantia had expressed no interest in taking his magic ability further, although he now expressed a clear desire to spread his wings beyond home, and thus what he could experience and who he could meet out in the world was completely out of her control. She gazed at him proudly and admired the young dragon he had already become. But just like when they had talked earlier, she had to fight off tears. She couldn't help but worry. As she finished this thought, Darlantia finished his meal and looked at her expectantly. "I'll leave the book and map here," Darlantia began. "I have both memorized anyway." His mother nodded, clutching both documents in her claws. "Now, Darlantia, be wary when flying over the great wilderness. The tree cover can be so thick that it's impossible to see what's below, even for a keen-eyed hunter such as yourself. As you've no doubt learned from all your reading, there are plentiful mysteries and dangers that lie in those forests, so make haste towards the human lands as swiftly as you can. A forest is no place for a dragon." With that, she sat on her haunches, clearly having said all she planned to say. Darlantia humbly bowed towards his mother, then spread his wings and launched himself from the tower swiftly, making use of all the muscles in his wings to ascend above his home. He circled it for a moment, and in a kind of salute breathed a shimmering cyclone of flames into the sky. His mother, in response, roared so loudly that it seemed to bounce around the entire valley. With that, Darlantia settled into a glide and began to head southeast. His adventure had begun. Chapter 4. As the afternoon had worn on, Clavius and Rawrenstaff had remained observers over the battle unfolding below. Making use of the oars, the longships at the front of the armada had swept into the bay, blocking off escape for any boats and ships docked in the expansive harbour. There had been heavy losses, as the castle atop the mountain had filled up with soldiers in light armour, who had constantly rained down arrows from longbows, large chunks of rock from catapults, and had dealt deadly damage with the ballista mounted on the walls. The heavy bolts of these could puncture a deck or take out a mast or sail if aimed right, and they had been. Plus, they were out of reach from anything the ships could throw back at them. The reinforced lighthouses on each side of the bay, however, were not as high up, and so not as lucky. Catapults mounted on many of the longships had, after many hours of bombardment, forced the soldiers garrisoned there to retreat. Many of the longships rammed their way into the harbour, and the Minotaurs and Lizard men swiftly disembarked. The port town had mostly been evacuated of civilians, leaving only the town's militia, lightly armoured men with short swords, spears, light crossbows, and round wooden shields. They had mounted a swift and effective defence. Makeshift barricades had been formed in the streets using carts, cargo, market stalls, anything the militia could lay their hands on, anything to buy the population time to escape via the gates into the countryside. Clavius had watched intently as these simple militiamen stood their ground against berserker minotaurs and swift lizard men, and had even mounted a counter-attack, using fire-bombs to try and set the harbour alight, which had been partially effective. The whole time, the militiamen had been aided by that castle, which focused its attention on the harbour with coordinated volleys of bombardment that caused havoc amongst the mercenaries. Eventually, after heavy losses and most of the Litograd evacuated, the militia began its own hasty retreat. The mercenaries hunted down any remaining life in the port town, making sure to duck inside buildings to save themselves from the mountain castle's constantly well-organized attacks. Litograd was a bloody mess, and the harbour was filled with sunk or sinking ships, some vessels still burning viciously. As per Clavius's plan, Much of the armada had remained out to sea to avoid needless losses. Overall, however, his scheme was yet to see success. He had not expected such stiff resistance and defense. Of course, he had neglected the fact that, for centuries, the lands he was attacking were part of an area that had been known as the Warring Kingdoms. The Five Kingdoms had finally found peace some 5 decades ago, but likely the strong militarism that characterized all of them had continued despite the peace. Clavius supposed that some of the militia and soldiers located on the castle could even be veterans of countless battles. The reason Clavius and Rohrenstaff had not yet joined the battle was due to the fact that Clavius had been scanning the castle for the reason he had come here. Whilst his detection spell confirmed that what he sought was here, it also detected another, much weaker, but significant energy trace, which could only mean that the castle was also defended by another magic user. Such a threat could seriously injure, perhaps even kill, Clavius or Rohrenstaff, and so Clavius had decided to keep himself and his companion out of the battle in hopes of drawing out his unknown foe to protect the port town. If they could do that, then the sorcerer and his dragon could more easily assess the danger of the enemy by observing their spells and how adeptly they conjured them. Alas, so far they had remained hidden within the castle. This, at least, seemed to confirm to Clavius that the mysterious magic user also had the ability to detect magic, and probably knew that 2 sources of it had been circling high above the port all afternoon. It was even possible they had even detected before, when on one of their scouting missions. The battle in the port is nearing its end, Rohrenstaff observed. Indeed, it is, Clavius agreed. We could commit the rest of the armada, perhaps even lay siege to the castle, the dragon suggested. There was a pause before he laughed thunderously. The pair both knew that had no chance of success. No, but that's what it's going to look like we're doing. Clavius then chuckled himself. He concentrated for a moment and projected himself onto the lead longship, still held in reserve with the others as a ghostly apparition. On the deck he was greeted by the main Minotaur leader and his second in command. The leader had light blonde fur, very rare for a Minotaur, and was covered in a dizzying amount of scars. Despite the leadership tradition, he was barely clothed except for a simple loincloth. The bull-headed mercenary was sat on a stool, leaning on a well-worn and well-used great axe. His second in command stood by his side. He had dark brown fur, and, unlike his leader, and truer to custom, was covered head to toe in a strange assortment of armor scavenged from countless battles. He was fiercely gripped his own great axe, as well as a claymore. "Your orders, O great wizard?" the leader snorted, bowing his head in mock deference. "The rest of the fleet is to storm the castle," Clavius began, but was interrupted by the armored Minotaur. "Madness!" he roared. "Such an attack is folly, suicide." "To act as a ruse," Clavius finished, winking at the armored Minotaur. The mercenary snorted angrily, stomping a hoofed foot, and swung his axe hard at Clavius's projection. The head passed through, gleaming. Clavius ignored the pointless display of rage and addressed the lead Minotaur again. "Assemble the rest of the fleet. Make it look like you're going to lay siege to the castle. That should draw their full attention to you for at least one volley." "We are to act as bait, then?" the leader asked. "Aye. Once you have their attention, and have taken the brunt of the attack, that's when my dragon and I will strike the castle in one killer blow." The Minotaur quietly scratched his chin. Then he stood, raised his axe, and yelled, "The final attack begins now!" The rest of the fleet roared in return. Clavius quickly cut his spell to avoid any further din. "And so?" Rohrenstaff asked. "And so, the final attack begins now," Clavius smirked. After some necessary organization, the fleet had assembled into a large wedge formation. The castle now loomed quiet and ominous, having decimated all the ships within its range. The few hundred minotaurs and lizard men in the town had taken shelter, and so the castle had withdrawn its efforts from there as well. The battle had drawn on into the late evening, and the sun was now setting in the west, bathing the battlefield in dark orange. The oars began to propel the longships towards the mountain. Drums beat, horns rang, and minotaurs bellowed and banged the sides of the ships. Those equipped with catapults even launched flaming projectiles, which smashed and banged against the side of the mountain, miles away from causing the castle any damage. Clavius watched cleanly as the well-organized troops atop the castle turned all their attention to the mad charge of ships. All 4 devastating catapults atop the towers were primed and ready, as were countless ballista and longbows. Almost every man had likely been drawn to the front of the castle to add their firepower to the volley that was coming, but still no sign of the magic wielder. They held their fire until their range and position could be maximized to cause the most devastating effect. The mountain and castle cast a long shadow over the fleet as it advanced. A mournful bellow of a horn echoed over the cliffs, and the full might of the castle's defences was hurled at the fleet. Clavius nor Rorenstaff could see what damage was caused, as before another arrow could even be notched by the defenders, the pair were diving, hard and fast, toward them. While plummeting, Rorenstaff shot a fireball, which blasted the tower left of the gate, and then he snapped his wings open, expertly slowing into a glide above their target. He unleashed a torrent of flame, which first engulfed one of the back towers, then the back wall, and finally the last of the back towers. As he adeptly finished his glide around the perimeter of the castle, he rose above the last of the towers and shot a point-blank blast of shimmering fire as he passed over it. In one fatal move, all 4 towers and the back wall had been annihilated. The screams and shouts of countless soldiers could now be heard from the devastation. Hovering above the castle gate, Rorenstaff breathed a prolonged jet of flame to consume each wall and the keep directly in front of him and Clavius. The dragon ceased his flames, and both he and Clavius marvelled at the fruits of their extraordinary surprise attack. Most of the castle was now beautifully aflame, but structurally intact. Only the courtyard, currently blocked from their view by the burning keep, had gone unscathed. Clavius cast another magic detection spell. What he saw was below the courtyard, but on the courtyard itself. "Brace yourself, Rorenstaff. The magic user has finally appeared," he said. Rorenstaff wordlessly acknowledged this by flying around the keep to reveal the courtyard. They were met with an extraordinary sight, as a large contingent of men, around 40 or so, had formed in the courtyard. They wore heavy armour and helmets, and had flowing white cloaks. On the shields and the breastplates, they all bore the symbol of a blazing sun. Weapons-wise, most of them had sheathed longswords, and were currently equipped with kite shields and long spears. Those towards the back wielded heavy crossbows. At the back of the organised knights stood a petite figure in a light blue cloak, their face hidden by a hood. The knights had organised themselves in a semicircle formation facing Rorenstaff and Clavius. 3 rows of shield and spear, a row of the heavy crossbow, and a hooded figure at the back. Before the 2 could react, they were pelted by a volley of heavy crossbow bolts. At that range, not strong enough to penetrate a dragon's scales, but the hooded figure held up a hand, and a forceful gale struck Rorenstaff. Clavius had to hold on firmly in order not to fly off his mount. The gale was so strong that it knocked Rorenstaff through a wall of burning smoke and below the rim of the castle walls. The dragon regained his composure and flew upwards, but was hit by another precise volley of bolts through the smoke. The magic user must be directing their aim, Clavius thought to himself. Rohrenstaff flew through the smoke, spreading embers and redirecting the roiling darkness down with his powerful wings. The hooded figure dissipated it away from the knights. The crossbowmen were still reloading, but another line of knights hurled their spears at the dragon. Luckily, in each case, the dragon had faced the volleys head-on, and thus shielded Clavius from any threat. Many spears were aimed for the head. Thankfully, they missed the eyes, but some tore into Rohrenstaff's more vulnerable wings. In response, he shot a cone of fire point blank at the clustered knights. Again, the attack was countered by the hooded figure, who deflected it away and spread flames across the courtyard. They're strong, thought Clavius, but untested. He shot a bolt of lightning at the hooded figure again, and like the fire, it was deflected rather than blocked. The blue bolt bounced widely and struck a hole in one of the castle walls. Rohrenstaff flew over the knights and swung down with his tail, sending a good few dozen of them flying. Meanwhile, Clavius used his telekinesis to lift debris from their initial attack and hurled them back to earth once Rohrenstaff had regained some altitude. It sent the knights ducking for cover or boldly holding their ground with kite shields outstretched. The hooded figure used their own magic to slow the larger pieces, place them gently in the courtyard. One of the knights, with a red plume in his helmet and a more elaborate sun emblazoned on his breastplate and shield, barked orders, and those not dead or injured effortlessly got back in formation. By now, many survivors from the castle, weapons still intact, had joined the knights too. That mournful horn was sounded once again, rallying all survivors to the courtyard, and vastly strengthened the position they held, with the hooded figure keeping the fire and smoke at bay. From afar, Rohrenstaff and Clavius rained down hell as they circled, strafing the courtyard on hit-and-run flybys. They were barely breaking a sweat and faced ever minimal resistance, forcing the hooded figure to focus on defense. The position of the hooded figure, knights and soldiers grew worse by the second. Sensing victory, Clavius urged Rohrenstaff to move in closer. Still holding in the courtyard, the hooded figure suddenly went on the offensive. A glowing yellow whip suddenly materialized and struck out from their hand, aimed for Clavius. Rohrenstaff quickly took evasive maneuvers. The whip narrowly missed Clavius's head, but instead latched onto the joint of Rohrenstaff's wing and gripped it tightly. The dragon lost control and crashed on the roof of the keep, his back turned towards the courtyard. Clavius was exposed. The surviving knights and soldiers fired everything they had at the dragon and the vulnerable wizard. Clavius used his telekinesis to lift some rubble in front of himself, as spears, bolts and arrows pinged around him. Now he was angry. "Time to finish this," he roared. "Circle around, and I'll focus my magic into you." "Understood." The dragon, now with some significant wounds to his wings, took flight from the keep. Much of the roof collapsed in on itself below from the liftoff. Diving below the gate and circling back around towards the port, the sun now almost entirely faded, Rohrenstaff used the momentum to reappear above a now almost entirely destroyed back wall. As he did this, Clavius placed both hands on the base of the dragon's neck, focusing all his magic power into the dragon. The last thing the men saw was a black dragon with glowing purple eyes, unleashing such an unparalleled maelstrom of fiery energy that it was glowing blue from the intensity. Flames licked and danced across the entire mountain, consuming everything in their path. An attack like that could only be sustained for a short while, and feeling like the damage was done, Rohrenstaff halted the onslaught and hovered above the now completely annihilated courtyard. To his amazement and horror, from the ashes rose the now de-hooded magic wielder. It was a girl in her early 20s, covered in ash, save for the streaks of tears running from eyes filled with pure hatred. She clutched a completely burnt corpse, only identifiable by the melted red on its head that had once been that marvelous plume. She screamed. Lumps of rock and the glowing and bent armor and weapons of her comrades spun around her for a moment before she thrust both hands toward the dragon. The burning projectiles shredded his wings and embedded themselves painfully into his scales. Blood began to flow. Lumps of rock struck him with incredible force across his body, neck, and head. Rawnstaff, unable to withstand the barrage, dropped like a rock to the courtyard. He impacted hard, sending a blanket of ash flying into the sky. The girl dropped her hands and clutched the smouldering helmet of the red-plumed knight. Rawnstaff groaned fiercely, but was unable to move. From behind the dragon, Clavius emerged, cautiously heading towards the girl with his staff outstretched. He was completely unscathed and still had plenty of magical energy left. From the looks of it, she had probably used the last dregs of her energy in that onslaught. She looked completely defeated, tears dropping from her ashen face as she knelt in the destruction. "Don't kill me," she groaned. "Begging for your life won't," Clavius began, but she cut him off. "Don't kill me," she raised her head, "or you will face the full wrath of my family's kingdom." She spat on the ground and held her gaze defiantly. "You're powerful, very powerful, but untested and untrained. It's clear to see. Not many magic users in this part of the world, I take it." She said nothing. "A few years ago, perhaps I would have taken you in as an apprentice and invited you into a little guild of wizards I was a part of." She said nothing. "But now I can't let anything get in my way." He looked over at Rawnstaff, still laying on the ground, still breathing heavily. "And you hurt my friend. My brother and his army will destroy you. A millennium of war runs through our veins. I know what it is you seek below our feet. Our kingdom is sworn to defend it. Leave now, so that you and your stupid dragon may live a long life." She spat. Clavius conjured a magic dagger and knelt down beside the girl. He looked at her briefly. No doubt she was a true beauty under all the ash. He struck her swiftly in the heart without another moment's hesitation. Thanks for listening. Check out the full book, link in the description, and subscribe for weekly editions to the Darlantia audiobook series.